Well, BG, here we are. Another boat and another day.
Adam and the boys from Coldwater up there in Canada cleaning up those waterways one boat at a time, and I got a feeling as we go through this episode of Boating News, we're going to have a few new vessels that need to be salvaged as well. Welcome back, crew, to this week's episode of Boating News of the Week, and our first story to make the boating news this week is going to follow just down that line, as we've got two new vessels that were left in the water and will need to be salvaged, starting with this one right here, which wound up sinking off the coast of Florida this past weekend. The vessel seen in the images is an 80-foot sunseeker named Atlantis, and the vessel first reported a problem around 11:30 Saturday morning when the two crew members on board realized the vessel was taking on water. The vessel is believed to have hit a submerged dredge pipe piling that was just below the waterline, causing massive damage to the hull as seen in these images here. The two crew members who were on board the vessel at the time of the incident were rescued by local authorities, and salvage plans are being worked on by the owners of the vessel, but this was not the only boat that was abandoned this past weekend, as these images have been floating around online as well of an abandoned yellowfin off of Meigs Point up in Connecticut. Apparently 7 people were on board this vessel late Sunday night approximately around 11:30 p.m. when all of a sudden the vessel wound up hitting a submerged ledge near Clinton Harbor. The Coast Guard was alerted to the incident and wound up assisting the 7 passengers who were on board the vessel, but at the time the vessel was left to adrift and was eventually spotted the next morning by local fishermen on the beach as seen here, and local authorities are working on removing the vessel now. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to be another vessel that was left abandoned, but this time it was only left abandoned overnight, and at least we got the video footage. But this is from North Carolina, where apparently the vessel you see in these images, where the crew's trying to pull it off, has actually been on this beach for over 24 hours. The crew went out for a nice Saturday trying to enjoy their day, when all of a sudden the vessel, they beached it at high tide, and the next thing they knew as the tide went out, the boat was stuck. They waited for the next high tide to come through, but it didn't come back quite high enough to get the vessel removed, so they decided to wait until the next day, but upon arriving on the next day as well, they found that their boat was still pretty severely stuck at high tide, and they couldn't get it out. So all of a sudden, salvage operations began, but not the kind of salvage operations you would typically expect. As this is not the pros out here doing it, they just enlisted whoever they could get to help them to try and pull this vessel off the beach and back into the water. Fortunately for them, a good Samaritan did lend a hand and offered to help them try and refloat the vessel. They are doing this a little different than normal though. Typically, if we saw one of the pros, Sea Tow or Towboat US out here trying to pull a boat like this off the beach back into the water, they would typically attach a line to the bow of the vessel, try and flip it around, and get it pulled out that way, but this crew's decided to go with the stern pull, which is still just a little unique, because typically when you do this, the stern starts digging into the sand, and it makes it more difficult. Now fortunately you can see they got a little room to work, as the vessel did start to pull, and they got a few inches of water underneath the boat, and now they've enlisted the troops off the beach as well. As we can see at the bow, we have several people up here who are ready to push, as the towing vessel is going to pull, and here we go, they wind up breaking free, and finally after the boat sitting on the beach for more than a day, they are able to successfully get this one off, but I'm sure this is probably a common scene. Holiday weekends are always nuts out there on the water. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to the Bahamas, where this past week the U.S. Coast Guard found and rescued 2 missing boaters who had disappeared off the island of Samana Cay. The 2 boaters left in an 18-foot pleasure vessel and never made it to their final destination, so the Bahamas Royal Defense Force alerted the Coast Guard, who then launched an aerial rescue operation to attempt to find the boaters. They wound up locating the 2 boaters approximately 55 miles from land. They were still on board their 18-foot vessel, but unfortunately the vessel had become disabled. The Coast Guard dropped a care package containing food, water, and a radio, but unfortunately the 2 boaters were unable to secure the package, so the Coast Guard then immediately dropped a rescue swimmer to make contact with the boaters. The 2 boaters were airlifted from their vessel and taken back to safety without any major injuries reported. The Coast Guard always reminds you, if you're heading offshore, make sure you have the proper equipment on board in case you need assistance or rescue, such as a working radio. Thanks for watching, crew. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening out on your waterways, be sure to hit us up on Facebook or Instagram and let us know, and you might see your stories over here, just like Adam Coolidge and AJ Phillips did this week. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button here.